Wonderful. Well, on this International Women's Day, let me just say, I think I'm the only boy speaking today, that it is a tremendous privilege to be able to convene a dialogue with the many talented women and leaders who are presenting to us today. And I might also just invite all the men in the room, the Zoom room, to be reflecting on our shared responsibilities to end gender discrimination against women and girls, including by advocating for a universal childcare system, by taking on more responsibility to share equally unpaid caregiving at home, and to care enough not to be violent. I think it's really critical for men to be thinking about these issues on International Women's Day as well. My name is Paul Kershaw. I am a proud and longstanding professor at the Human Early Learning Partnership and the founder of Generation Squeeze. And I come to you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Katzie people, which is at the confluence of the Pitt and Fraser Rivers in an area that now on colonized maps we call Pitt Meadows. I want to jump into our dialogue today with our presenters. And in order to set it up, I want to share how hundreds of you in the audience today first engaged with the very same issues that our presenters are talking about. Namely, like, what do we think are going to be some of the lasting impacts of the pandemic on BC children and family? And I thought before turning it over to the speakers to share a wee bit more, let's first hear from some of the ideas that have arisen with you. So audience members talked about their concerns about increasing mental health issues and actually fear of germs and maybe even future pandemics. There's the impact on the social skills of children as they've been, sometimes having less interactions with their peer networks. Long-term impact of isolation and lack of community connection. Families won't bounce back. These are some of our worries. Growing inequity, poverty, and food insecurity. Parent stress and the impact that stress can have on children. We know that stress can be contagious, and how's that relating to divorce rates and child abuse risks and domestic violence. And then another dominant theme in the ideas that the audience has been sharing is about concerns around wait lists for services and reductions in delays in access to services, particularly for children with extra support needs. So those have been the kinds of themes that you have been sharing all along. And as we've also heard today, we have been seeing from our presenters. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now so we can see more of the presenters before us. And we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to jump in to individual questions for each of you and then end on a shared question. And hopefully we're going to be doing all of that, still winding up by no later than 11:18. That is our mission. And if we can share that responsibility, that would be great. My first question is going to be for Jennifer. And Jennifer, I want to pick up on a question you were asked by David Josie, if I'm recalling the person's name correctly, who asked, how can we contribute to your advocacy efforts? And I want to ask you this question from the standpoint of someone at the Human Early Learning Partnership, because we tend to focus on the population of BC children. And when we think about the pandemic, it's harmed the entire generation of children and their families. Now, that experience of harm has very definitely been shaped by the intersection of racism and classism and sexism, et cetera. And we clearly need to be focusing on those areas of marginalization. And I think this is something where the legacy of your office, you tend to actually come with a focus on those who are especially marginalized. And I think in particular about the amazing work that your predecessors and you continue to do in terms of thinking about children who've been in the care of the state and when that has been breaking down. But given that before the pandemic, we had 1 in 3 children under the age of 6 who were vulnerable, and most of the majority of those kids who were vulnerable, stretched beyond the low-income households into the majority of the population. And given that the pandemic has just really harmed the entire group, as we've been talking about, it has me wondering about how groups like HELP or Generation Squeeze or the 10-a-day childcare campaign can partner more with your office in order to bring a broader population level focus to what's happening to children generally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. A couple of things that I wanted to pick up on there. One is you mentioned intersectionality, and I think that's absolutely critical. So as a general plea, one of the things that I'm most worried about is as we come out of the pandemic, we'll be looking to economic recovery, or we'll be looking to going back to what we knew beforehand. But I think the pandemic has revealed that what we had beforehand wasn't working either. And it's become much, much worse. And so I fear greatly simple solutions to complex problems. So the importance of intersectionality and appreciating the social determinants of health, and others were speaking to this as well, of understanding the impact of income security, educational attachment, housing stability, et cetera, as well as racialization and racism, and the pervasiveness of racism in our society, and trauma as well. So really we have to kind of be leaning in and saying, so what we've done before isn't going to serve us well going forward, particularly because we've all been impacted, and the generation has been so significantly, young ones have been so significantly impacted. So that's one thing, is let's not go for the simple solutions and just say, oh, we just need to put a little bit more here, or a little bit more here. Now's the time for kind of reimagining. So I think you spoke about yes, absolutely. We have spoken about those who are most on the margins. However, we can't do that well without taking a look at what the well-being across all children and youth is. So in terms of the partnerships, I think one of the reasons that Pippa is with us now is actually to bring that kind of partnership and expand our circle much more than we have done before, to bring a population health sensibility into our work. So A, I guess, hold us accountable, and B, as I've said before, reach out and say, here's what we're working on, and here's some things that you need to pay attention to. The research, for example, from Sina and Evelyn is like, okay, you identified some things that have taken us like another 4 or 5 months down the way, and provided us with some really significant information. Magdalena, your research has taken us another bit down the way as well. So it's like, clearly we have to figure out those ways of working together. So yeah, I think you're right. It's intersectionality. Let's not go for the simple solutions, and we've got to work together and share our resources and find that common voice and that pressure to bring things forward.
Common voice and pressure. I like that. I'm going to continue to think about how we build and grow that in the days and weeks ahead. I think your focus on the impact of racism prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, is critical. And I might take that as a bit of a segue to direct my next question to Reanna. Reanna, during our last Help Expo in February, another member of AASC, Diane Elliott, was part of the dialogue, and she expressed her concern about the COVID pandemic, but emphasized that we have to recognize that this viral pandemic is occurring amidst a much more persistent and long-lasting, what she called a racism pandemic. And so I wanted to return to that theme, especially given Jennifer's observations right now. Like, what do you think about Diana's emphasis on the racism pandemic, and how do you think it's shaping or likely to shape the legacy of the pandemic?
Well, I think that it's actually, kind of brought the pandemic racism into the forefront. I know that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has recognized that there is systemic racism. And I think that needs to be addressed. As an Indigenous person working, trying to work with federal government, I have faced that racism often and still. So I think that it's brought it to the forefront. I think we all need to look at ourselves. Sometimes we, from our point of privilege, from our learning as growing up, we might have a bit of racism, discrimination within ourselves. And how do we change that within ourselves? And how do we change that within our families? How do we change that within our communities? And listening to the presentations today, the one thing that I wanted to bring forward was, many of our isolated communities, for this online learning, we don't have very good internet connections. We do not have computers. We do not have things to help our children to learn. And I think that's important to look at because then that population is that much farther behind because they don't have those things at home. But I think with racism, we need to address it. It's been far too long. I'm approaching my 70s and I have lived with racism my whole life. So it would be nice to have that gone. So masicho gleko.
So I think you're inviting us all to reflect on our shared responsibility to not only make the adaptations in our daily lives to prevent the spread of the viral pandemic, but to also think about what we need to do to adapt in our lives and change our practices in order to address the racism pandemic. Let me take that as a segue to move to Magdalena, and then I'm going to come to Evelyn. Magdalena, I think you might get the quote of the day, at least from my standpoint, when you said COVID is not a snow day. I think that might be one of the biggest understatements I've heard this year, but I like it and I'm going to work with that. So COVID is not a snow day. And when we were preparing for the dialogue, and I was asking you about some of the things that are, you're worrying you and make you hopeful amid the pandemic. One of your observations was that you think that the inequities impacting childhood, parenting, and family have become part of the general discourse in Canada. And that's giving you a little bit of hope as we move forward. And I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit more about why you think that's so, because I have to confess, I sometimes worry the opposite. From a Gen Squeeze perspective, over the last decade, we've really been trying to work hard to convince Canadians that the generation raising kids are deserving of more support, deserving of more public investment, deserving of societal adaptations to address some of the challenges facing them. And that's involved us trying to help people understand that socioeconomic risks have really shifted towards that younger demographic, going to school longer to land jobs that pay less, than they face these crazy housing prices, and especially in our urban settings. And they got larger debt levels and student debt levels. At the moment, they're needing to pay for their own childcare, which costs more than double university, generally speaking, and parental leave can often be very unaffordable. So that's sort of their private squeeze context. And we were making some headway, I think, over the last many years. And then the pandemic has come. And because of the way in which the risks for serious illness and the risks for dying have fallen to our aging loved ones disproportionately, I think the narrative about who's especially vulnerable in society has shifted again to focus more on those who are older. So I'm wondering, where are you seeing in the public discourse that the inequities facing the generations of children and their families, where are you seeing that really bubble up and being prominent?
Being prominent or promising?
I'll let you choose either.
Yeah. Well, I think one reason why I was a little bit hopeful is, almost personal. My own child is now in young adulthood, and being in academia, having a young child was quite challenging to kind of balance life and work and do it well. And of course, I do not have the same challenges as the parents I'm talking about in terms of having to do that right now. But I totally recognize the impact. And I think one thing that has so many people you talk to, and there are children kind of playing in the background. We know who has children, and we know how difficult it is. I'm kind of hoping from the point of view academia, but also other workplaces, that it is absolutely okay now to say, my child is sick, I have to stay at home. And it's not just for women, but also for men. So and it wasn't in my script, but I'd like to add a little bit to your question about encouraging men to kind of ask questions and respond. That to me, one of the most positive findings of our study was that it was the mostly female kindergarten educators who had partners who shared child caring responsibilities with them that had the lowest levels of mental health issues. So I think that's kind of gives me a little bit of hope. That could be naivety as well, because I can see obviously where things are falling apart, in the poorest communities and in racialized communities. And it's all intersectional because it's those populations that have the jobs that potentially were more precarious. But I think we should build on it. We should build on the recognition that most people have more than just work responsibilities, that they also have families. And it's not possible to just sweep everything under the carpet and go to work and pretend that everything is fine. I can guarantee you from my own experience and people I work with, if I'm comfortable about the well-being of my children, I'm a much better worker. And to a certain extent, I'm hoping that that's coming to the fore.
Okay. Let's hope that it is. And I guess it becomes, again, we're talking actually multiple times about our shared responsibilities to make things happen as we're building back better. I guess ensuring that we do have that insight that you're drawing our attention to become a greater part of the societal discourse and institutionalize into our workplaces and our policy becomes a shared responsibility for us to advocate for. All right, conscious time. I'm doing okay. Evelyn, I really was enjoying your presentation, and one of the there was a moment where you were tapping into the range of anxieties that have grown for us over the pandemic. This is a big theme in your presentation, and it dovetails with some of the feedback we'd heard from our audience members who were telling us about what they worry about. And I want to bring two observations together. There's sort of this shared sense that going forward, many people, both children and adults, may have an increased fear about germs or even the risk of future pandemics, and that's going to be a new source of anxiety for us all in a world that already was filled with enough reasons to be anxious. And so that's had me thinking in prep for today's call about the things that make us frightened. And I do that sometimes because in response to COVID, our fear about catching a virus has caused us to dramatically change our behavior in ways that no one would have predicted a year ago. And while that has been hard and harmful, it often always gives me hope to how we might make other adaptations to address systemic issues. So I guess I partly want to say there's a part of me that wished that people might be a little more frightened of, like, say, climate change or the pervasive amount of poverty or home prices that are leaving people's earnings behind, because maybe that would then, if we had the fear about those things, we might adapt more to the pressures we're facing as a society. So here's my question to you. I hope you might be able to answer it. I wonder, are there ways where we can think about going forward about how to try and redirect people's fear about perhaps future pandemics, which might be, the kind of thing that would cause us anxiety in ways that are not necessarily helpful, to direct them to be more worried or anxious about things like climate change or unaffordable housing, et cetera, which could be constructive. Given your expertise and work, are there opportunities for us to do that as we try to build back better?
Great point. So you want to pick the things that people worry about. That's what you're saying? You don't
I'm not sure that's possible.
You want to decide what they're going to worry about. Okay. I mean, I could send people to you. I'm just joking. Yeah. So, no, but really such good points. And I think, so in non-COVID times, I tend to spend a lot of my time focusing on OCD, which, can be captured a little bit by people who worry about dirt and germs, but it's so much more than that. And just as a little side note, a lot of the folks I think who have OCD are doing fine now. Or they just feel like, okay, finally everyone gets it. Why I don't want to touch a doorknob? See, yeah. It wasn't me. But really, I think one of the core pieces here is uncertainty. And for people who have a harder time tolerating uncertainty or not knowing what's going to come next, it's horrible. Because, especially, back in the day, uncertainty about, am I going to be able to have toilet paper? Or like other more important things like uncertainty about, am I going to lose my job? Is my child going to get my parents sick? All of these unanswered questions. And I think, I've just so valued what I've heard today, but I think just to come back to one of the pieces that when kids are little and they're going out in the world and it's an uncertain place and all of that kind of thing, they look to the adults above them to see if they're freaking out, stressed out, if they're signaled by whatever's going on, if they're going to see it as a dangerous world or as a place where, okay, you can maybe fall down, but you get up again and everything goes on. But I think what's happening is with parents and adults who have had sort of some predictability in terms of how things play out are thrown into this time of uncertainty, and where kids may be more resilient to kind of go with things a little bit. Usually they're looking to their parents, and as we see by all these different graphs, they're not doing so well. So I think this practicing becoming comfortable with uncertainty is a big thing. So I think if adults and kids and teens kind of sort of embrace that a little bit, that, okay, we don't know what's going to happen next, but we're going to continue on, that type of thing. And we're not going to avoid everything. So I really think that's kind of a big piece. And what I do worry about a lot is whatever the new normal is going to be, when things go back, for those people who had a tendency towards anxiety, that they're using this as a reason, oh, I can't leave my house. It's okay. I can't go to school. I can't go out with my friends anyway. Don't make me do that. Where they've gotten out of that for a year, the longer you avoid something, the harder it is to jump back into life. So I don't, I kind of went off tack from your question. I think it's good to be realistic and being concerned about things that happen in the world and non-avoidant. And people should be concerned about climate change. But I think you want children to have a sense of being able to make a contribution. And I think what uncertainty drives is the sense of, I don't know what to do to protect myself or my child. And that sort of drives the anxiety. And just one other quick piece. So, and I've heard it a few times, so I just don't want the takeaway being that we're trying to diagnose people or say people are mentally ill or to stigmatize people or any of that. However, we want to know how people are doing, and just closing your eyes and putting your hands over your ears and not asking the question, I don't think is the way to go. So I've had it from a few different folks. That's kind of why we very intentionally asked those clinical scales, because we have, so this is not like normal worry. It's a worry that's debilitating, that keeps kids from doing the normal stuff they need to do, and parents. That's the generalized anxiety disorder piece.
Thanks for clarifying that point too. I saw that in the questions as well. We are coming up on time, and so I have one last question. I'm going to pose it to all four of you, and I'm hoping that you can answer me each in one sentence. That is a tall order, but let's try. In this moment of uncertainty that continues and will continue for a variety of months ahead of us, to Evelyn's point, at this stage of the pandemic, what sustains hope for each of you that a better path for today's children and families actually remains open as we build back better? One sentence, what's keeping you hopeful? Why don't we go in this order? Reanna, Jennifer, Magdalena, and then we'll round up with Evelyn.
Well, my hope is that we have an end to poverty, an end to racism, and that we will all treat each other fairly. I think having gone through this pandemic all together, I think we have a little bit of an insight maybe that we didn't have before, that it will help us to kind of see the whole picture and heal wholly. See.
Jennifer.
And I will rip off of that. Thank you, Reanna. I hold out hope because of what has been surfaced, and we can't deny it any longer. And I've also held up hope because I have seen collaboration and experimentation and creativity unlike anything I've seen in my 43 years in this field. And so that holds me, the fact that we are seeing things that we haven't seen and that we're trying things that we haven't tried before, that gives me hope.
Magdalena.
So just to add to that, I think we've seen that social supports work, that we shouldn't be necessarily worried about the budgets being overdrawn. So I think that would galvanize voters on all ends of the political spectrum to demand it now.
And Evelyn.
I've been inspired by a sense of a community that I've experienced, or, when we're all kind of in this together. There's no one, no matter what color your skin is, whatever, although it can be differentially impactful, sort of a sense of community, and systems that used to be rigid being forced to be more flexible and problem solving and practical, which is not necessarily always the way governments or systems are inclined to do things. So it gives me hope.
Wonderful. Well, I've been inspired by the four of you, and thank you very much for your presentations earlier and for the dialogue now. And I'm going to turn it back to Joanne.